Welcome to episode 4 of The Seed by Dan Thomas, published in 1967. Adapted for Sci-Fi radio theater production by Gailyn Porter. Previously in our story, we found Big Mike on his way up the rickety water tower, inviting God to have his way with him. He reached the top without mishap, only to pass out on the high platform. Alice, meanwhile, returned to the house for another drink, the sweet melody of La Paloma, and some time with her notebook. She had an epiphany. Most of life is nothing but repetitious circles. The next morning, Rose went to Alice's apartment with an ultimatum from Alice's husband, Eddie. Eddie wanted a divorce. Rose succeeded in convincing Alice to go and talk with Eddie. When Alice reached the house, she found a for sale sign on the lawn. The inevitable argument ensued. Eddie fed up with Alice's defection, Alice begging for more time. Eddie allowed her 3 more weeks to make up her mind if she agreed to stop seeing Betsy and talk with Reverend Angelico. Alice agreed. Back at Tex-Aero, Alice learned that security had accessed her private files. Rose revealed that Tex-Aero was not just worried about her change in lifestyle. They were presuming that Alice was now a security risk. Rose pled with Alice to be more discreet and instructed her to keep her projects out of the company computers. When Alice suggested that she work at home, Rose told her that her apartment was probably bugged too. Find out in episode 4 what Alice does next. 3 days passed before Alice noticed the brown men. She didn't know how long they'd been there, but one morning when she left the apartment, she saw one in a car at the curb. 6 blocks later, when she stopped for a traffic light, another was 2 cars behind. A brown man tailed Alice all the way to the plant. When she left work, there was another in an identical brown suit. He followed Alice home. Curious, Alice left the apartment and drove down to Bowie. The brown man followed. Alice turned into a shopping center. The brown man turned in behind her. Alice circled a row of parked cars. The brown man followed her. Alice went around again. The brown man followed, slowing. Alice went around a 3rd time. The brown man pulled into a vacant space and watched. When Alice left, the brown man didn't follow. The next day, after the mid-morning shift, the brown man followed her to work. Alice computed the odds against identical men making identical trips with her. The result, something like more than 6 trillion to 1, convinced her she was being followed. The knowledge was more of an annoyance than a worry. She was glad Betsy had taken her other dress and moved back to Big Mike's pad. If the apartment was bugged, as now seemed likely, she wouldn't want Betsy's chatter recorded. That really would give Tex-Aero something to think about. That evening, Alice left her apartment and drove over the freeway to the Mixmaster, where north, south, east, and west freeways came together in a confusing mass of concrete, ribbons, and bows. She drove rapidly into the maze of trucks and autos, whipping the Volks at the last moment across 2 and 3 lanes into an exit and shooting off in one direction or another. Then she would throw the Volks into a sharp Immelman turn or reverse Immelman by exiting off, under, or over, and back into the mixmaster at the first opportunity, only to repeat the process in a different direction. After she had done this 6 times, she drove off the South Freeway into a quiet residential street and parked, watching the rearview mirror. She waited patiently for 15 minutes. Confident that she had lost the brown men, she drove through back streets to keep her appointment with Reverend Angelico at the church. The minister was waiting in the church annex. He came bounding toward Alice across the thick carpeted foyer, attired in a sweatsuit with a drawstring belt. Even under the bulky sweatsuit, his ex-All-American frame looked lean and athletic. His continental haircut showed his heavy black mane off to best advantage. And as he turned his dazzling smile full on Alice, the white symmetry of his teeth had the accomplished perfection of a professional actor.
Good to see you again, Alice.
His rich bass voice boomed in conspiratorial familiarity.
If you'd been a little earlier, we could have worked out on the trampoline together.
He inhaled, then exhaled forcibly.
Whew, I'm pooped. I could use some refreshments. Would you like something from the bar?
Alice nodded and followed the minister into the young adult's hullabah room. Although she had known Angelico almost 5 years now, she was still amazed at the change in him from those first few months. The Reverend Angelico had arrived fresh from the seminary, under the delusion that he was a preacher of the gospel, rather than a pastor of a suburban church. His first sermon was pure fire and brimstone. In thundering voice, he warned the congregation that if they did not end their materialistic pursuits immediately and embrace the true concepts of Christianity, they faced an eternity of torment and damnation. Most of the congregation received the warning in stunned silence. A few children broke into tears and had nightmares for a week. Many were angered. Materialistic pursuits? Where the hell does he think this church came from? And a hurried, secret meeting of the deacons was called to determine what could be done about the Reverend Angelico. But before the meeting convened, a second problem erupted. One of the congregation's middle-aged spinsters, who would have been considered asexual if anyone had regarded her in a sexual way at all, trapped the young pastor in his study under the pretext of seeking his spiritual guidance, and all but violated him. This incident was the harbinger of a real scandal. The young minister was, as one teenage miss put it in the vernacular, a living doll. His stern, paternal demeanor seemed to strike a basic chord in some women. The response of female church members of all ages to the minister's questioning of their spiritual state was staggering. Fortunately, the Reverend Angelico was either too dedicated or too ignorant to take advantage of this windfall. He went to the Board of Deacons with the problem before they came to him. Alice was not on the board, but Eddie had been there in an ex officio capacity as one of the heads of the Auxiliary Guild. And since husbands and wives of board members attended meetings as a matter of course, Alice had a ringside seat. The Reverend Angelico had arrived almost on the verge of tears. Nothing in his seminary training, he explained, had prepared him to handle anything of this scope. There had been mention that perhaps in his career he might encounter a certain type of woman whose certain psychological quirks might veer her toward ministers. But nothing had been said about scores of them in one congregation. A psychological consultant was hired. The diagnosis was quick and explicit. With his strong, authoritative sermons, the Reverend Angelico had quickly established himself as a father figure in the subconscious of various members of the congregation. In fact, it was a little more complicated than that, the report explained. The Reverend Angelico was the embodiment of what those susceptible wanted their fathers to be. In the psychologist's vernacular, a living wish fulfillment. With his reactionary evangelistic sermons, the Reverend Angelico was playing with dynamite, the consulting firm concluded. If a serious tragedy or multiple tragedies were to be averted, the Reverend Angelico must step down from his pulpit and become a more regular fellow. Under the consulting firm's direction, the Reverend Angelico complied with surprising alacrity. He joined 2 breakfast Kiwanis clubs, 3 noon rotaries, and an evening Toastmasters. He became a Mason and was raised to the water pistol packingest shrine group in town. The children who had cried and had nightmares after his first sermon soon learned he was not only an ex-All-American of the gridiron, but also an expert in all sports from baseball, softball, and basketball through jacks, marbles, and multi-peg, and was available to coach, referee, or participate at their pleasure. In short, the Reverend Angelico, or Maurice, as everyone now called him, had become such a regular fellow that church membership had more than tripled in the 5 short years since he assumed the pastorship. The private study, which he first had sought to use for private consultations, was now kept locked. No church member had seen the inside of that study in 5 years. But before Angelico had abandoned his serious ways and become a regular fellow, Alice had discovered that he knew more about classical theology than any man Alice had ever met. And that was the main reason she had come to see him tonight.
What'll it be?
Angelico asked from behind the bar.
Coke, sundae, shake? How about a split? We have about everything.
A shake would be fine. Chocolate, very dry.
While the minister busily tended bar, Alice examined the hullabaloo room, gaily decorated for next weekend's Youth for Christ Ya banquet. Absently, she read the bulletin board, a list of record swaps, dance classes, and dance committee listings.
Our youth program is going great guns. I suppose you know your 2 boys are very active in it.
Alice saw the conversational flowchart developing. Angelico was backing into the subject.
Yes, so I've heard.
Angelico spoke with his back to Alice, turning the metal cylinders slowly on the machines.
But I've been a little concerned about those 2 boys.
Oh?
Alice was enjoying Angelico's oblique approach.
Why?
The minister took the milkshakes off the machine and faced her, but did not meet her gaze.
Well, frankly, Alice, Eddie called me before you did. I gather that you're not living at home anymore.
A regular fellow, Alice supposed, could only give advice as one pal to another.
No, Maurice, I've kicked over the traces.
Angelico poured the shakes and slid Alice's across the imitation marble counter.
I like those two boys a lot, Alice. I just hate to see them growing up without a mother.
Why?
Angelico gave an embarrassed chuckle.
Well, hell, Alice, don't you think the boys need a mother?
No.
You're putting me on.
Angelico looked directly at Alice for the first time since he'd broached the subject.
Not at all. I was estranged from my children a long time before I was separated from my husband. Children don't need parents anymore. The whole thing has become completely institutionalized, a gigantic machine. They've got den mothers, scoutmasters, and all that to counsel them, their Sunday school teacher to give them moral guidance, their school teachers to educate them, little league coach to instill in them the good old American spirit of competition, win or die trying, their dancing instructor to give them poise and grace, dramatic school to teach them to communicate with their peers and anyone else that will listen, classes at the library and museum so they can weave baskets and mold pottery, be handy if we have an atomic war, I guess, figure paint, and I don't know what all. And when they get old enough, they'll have high school courses in sex, contraception, and how to drive a car, and that ought to get them started in life if anything will. Kids don't need parents anymore, Maurice. We farmed out all our parental obligations long ago.
Angelico had listened to Alice's tirade with a bemused smile. He shook his head sadly.
Surely you're not serious. What about love? What about a home? Family ties? Mother identification?
They left me. I didn't leave them. I suppose they'll identify with pots and baskets or something. I don't know what all that running around will do to them psychologically, but if they turn out queer for wicker baskets or their dramatics coach, there's nothing I can do about it.
Now I know you're putting me on.
No, I'm not.
Angelico stared at Alice for a moment.
Alice, what has happened to you? I used to think that you and Eddie, well, had it made. You seemed happy enough. And hell, your family was a pillar in the church. And now, I just can't believe my own ears. The things Eddie has told me about you, and the way you talk. What has happened to you, Alice?
I copped out, just like you did.
Angelico put down his glass and stared at Alice, unsure whether he should take offense.
Like I did?
Yes, like you. I remember when you came here, those first sermons. What happened to you, Maurice?
Angelico's face reddened.
If you're putting me on, you're going too far, Alice. I don't have to take that. You know what happened.
I know you came here a dedicated minister. I know that you'd spent 8 years in training. I know that you could read the Bible in original Hebrew and Greek and were well grounded in theology. What happened to all that, Maurice? Did you forget all that when you took up baseball?
Now I know you're baiting me.
Angelico's jaw muscles tensed with anger.
And I feel called to remind you that I am still a man of the cloth.
That's exactly what I want to establish. I want to find out if you can still think as a minister, if you still have occasional theological thoughts behind that JC personality they've grafted on you.
There are many ways of serving God. That is of consolation to me, and I hope it will be to you.
Then you don't believe God is dead?
Angelico glared at her.
You're still baiting me.
Not necessarily. I want to ascertain the trend of your theological thinking these days.
Am I to take that question seriously?
Since it's apparently taken seriously in the seminaries these days, it might as well be discussed in the church.
God is not dead. Man cannot even contemplate eternity, the immensity of the universe, or the subtlety of God's ways. Yet he undertakes to arbitrarily judge that God is dead. What gross presumption! What base, classic, egocentric stupidity to think that because we cannot perceive the truths of our ancestors, they are no longer valid.
Angelico's face was still flushed with anger, and his dark eyes had taken on a murderous intensity. Alice smiled.
Now you're talking like the Reverend Angelico. I'll now ask the question that I came to ask. Is man dead?
Angelico frowned.
I beg your pardon?
Let me put it this way. Man is composed of atoms, atoms just as dead as those that make up this wood.
She tapped the false marble bar top for emphasis.
All those dead atoms, they all make up what we call a living man. My question is, how do we know he is living?
Angelico closed his eyes, searching for some elusive data deep in his memory store.
That question was raised a long time ago, as far back as the 18th century, in fact. Bishop Butler brought it up in the analogy of religion.
But it has never been answered, and it has even more significance today in the context of modern science.
Angelico rinsed the 2 malt glasses and put them in the sink. All his joviality was gone. He seemed older, tired. He dried his hands on a paper towel.
Let's go down to my study.
Alice followed him down the long hall and into the basement. She remembered the talk that in all the time since Angelico had been attacked in his study, it had been off limits to all church members. Not even the building custodian had a key. As far as she knew, Alice was the first person to be invited into Angelico's private study in 5 years. On first glance, there seemed to be few changes. The huge mahogany desk that had figured prominently in the assault still dominated the room. Then Alice noticed the books. 4 extra bookcases had been installed along the wall behind the door. Crude shelving, obviously erected by an amateur, but they were sturdy. Counting those stacked neatly on the floor along the walls, Angelico's study was jammed with more than 1,000 books.
I've been doing some research.
Alice read some of the titles. Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions by T.W. Doane. The World's 16 Crucified Saviors by Kersey Graves. Jesus, God, Man, or Myth by Hubert Kuttner.
Do I detect a strong atheistic overtone in your research?
Doubt is the handmaiden of belief. Conviction must be tempered in the fires of uncertainty. I have strengthened my faith by putting it to the test.
Sort of religious isometrics?
I suppose you could call it that. The atheists are a curious lot. They often work harder at disbelieving than the believers. They frequently uncover more evidence than the religious scholars. Their fallacy is in interpretation. They will go to any length to reject the obvious.
You mean they protest too much?
Precisely. I hope you will not mention my collection. There are few who would understand.
Of course.
Angelico went behind the desk and motioned Alice into one of the deep leather chairs.
About your question, if I recall correctly, Bishop Butler's basic tenets were expanded a few years later by a scientist named John Tyndall. He suggested that if atoms are not in themselves alive, then their function in the human body might be mechanical, and in a sense, man might be a machine.
I think the same question was debated by the ancient philosophers. They discussed whether man or animals are machines, and how man differs from animal.
Yes, but Tyndall, even with his limited knowledge of molecular structure, was the first to put it into a scientific context. That is what I'm driving at. Every generation must come to terms with faith in its own environment, in the light of its own knowledge. Perhaps we know more of the physical structure now than Tyndall. but we don't know much more about the universe as a whole.
What about the genetic code? Don't you feel we are getting to something basic? It seems conceivable to me that everything could be programmed, just like a program in a computer, to arrive at a certain point.
Angelico frowned.
I don't buy that. A man may be born a machine, but he becomes what he is through experience. Of course, genetics enter into it, but man is a thinking creature, shaped by his environment and experience.
I mean the whole bit, the whole universe. Take the genetic code from the beginning. Environment, everything could be programmed, controlled.
Angelico thought that over.
If I understand you correctly, you're making a scientific argument for predestination.
It is scientifically possible. Given enough machines and enough time, I could program the whole world from beginning to end, even with our present limited equipment. Of course, it would require millions of years and millions of machines, but it could be done. If we assume that there is a higher intelligence with better hardware, no doubt it could be done infinitely faster.
But that would rule out free will. For me, the idea that our life is laid out for us beforehand goes against all logic. If that is all there is, what is the point?
Perhaps it isn't so black or white. Maybe our choice is resisting what we are programmed for, fighting our genetic code. The point might be the end result, just as we would plant a seed, knowing that under proper conditions, a perfect flower will result, because biologically, the seed is programmed with that in mind.
Then let's extend your question. You are not asking if man is dead. You are asking if the entire universe is dead and functioning as a machine to produce some product.
I suppose so. I think it is rather egotistical of us to think that man himself is the product, the one perfect rose of the universe. I ran an interesting probability problem the other day. There undoubtedly are thousands of millions of planets in our galaxy alone, and at least 1,000 habitable by man-like organisms. But as far as we know, everything in the universe is composed of dead atoms.
Yet you have compiled all this material and are sitting there telling me about it. I too am in the process of contemplation. That alone should be some testimony for man.
I could put any thought we have into a cold analytical machine. True, we haven't learned yet how to make a machine-like genetic code with machines begetting machines in a Genesis-like chain, complete with and/or on-off gates. There could be atavistic projection of thought orientation.
What about man's mystic experiences?
I still have much work to do. Parapsychology, ESP, precognition, regression or prior existences under hypnosis, presences, all the things science has not explained.
I'm also thinking of the religious mystic experiences, not just Christian experiences. The Buddhists, for instance, have a very deep mystic religion, perhaps more comforting to the contemplative than our own. And yet even the most primitive people seem to have some acknowledgement of a supreme being.
An acknowledgement of something they don't understand. All religions have sprung from similar phenomena, perhaps atavistic memory, what Jung called the collective unconscious, maybe of Earth visits by creatures of machines of superior intelligence.
Alice pointed to the bookshelves.
Surely you have observed the close parallel in all religions.
What is the difference does that make? What if Christ was a UFO? All it adds up to is the same thing, that there is a supreme intelligence and that man has a purpose.
I want to know my purpose. I don't want to be used. If I am just a disposable machine here for a function, I want to know it.
Angelico considered that for a moment.
Would you accept this as a proper definition of a machine? Something that has an input, a process, and an output?
Yes.
Suppose we take your theory of an atavistic input, a genesis of machines, man controlled by the genetic code. Say we are programmed for a purpose. We know what our outward function, our process of living, the development of civilization. That is open to examination. Now, what do you think could be our output?
That is what I have to determine.
Isn't it obvious that the improvement of man, the raising of man to a higher species, a more godlike creature, is the only possible explanation?
If that is the purpose, then why wasn't he made that way to begin with? No, Maurice, I'm afraid man is here for some functional purpose he doesn't even suspect.
What in the world could that be?
When I find out, I'll let you know.
They fell, then, to discussing the classic theological proofs, as opposed to atheistic arguments. As Alice remembered, Angelico was well grounded in all religions. They talked late into the evening. When Alice left, Angelico escorted her to the door.
What can I tell Eddie?
But I just need time to think about things. If you tell him, maybe he will believe it.
I'll tell him because I believe you, but I doubt Eddie is in the mood to believe either of us.
For the next 2 weeks, the Brown men continued to harass Alice. They followed her everywhere she went, and by carefully arranging her desk at home, she ascertained that the apartment was searched frequently during her absence. With her research entering a critical phase, and the ban on her project at Tex-Aero, she had to find a place to keep her material. Big Mike, she felt, would know someone in his coterie who could help. On Friday night, Alice drove alone to a drive-in movie. As she anticipated, the on-duty brown man parked outside the exit to wait. When the movie started, Alice left the car on foot, climbed a 6-foot wooden fence at the rear of the theater, circled through weed-covered lots until she was well away from the area, and then she caught a bus to town. She walked aimlessly through department stores crowded with Friday night shoppers until she was confident she was no longer being followed. Then she walked down a side street, through an alley, and up one flight to the cellar. Big Mike was sprawled on some cushions by the bandstand, surrounded by ditty boppers. Wincing involuntarily against the noise of the band, Alice pushed her way through the crowd.
Hey, there's the professor.
Betsy came out of the milling throng. She grabbed Alice's arm and shouted into her ear.
I got to talk to you.
Alice nodded that she understood, but didn't attempt a reply. She steered Betsy along with her toward Big Mike. Alice couldn't keep from worrying. She did not know how long the brown men had been monitoring her. Rose had mentioned that the security meeting had said something about new friends. They might know that she frequented the cellar. If they discovered that she had left the drive-in, they might check here.
Let's go to a booth.
She had to shout to Big Mike to be heard above the electronic noise of the band. Big Mike extricated himself from the tangle of scantily clad women and followed Alice and Betsy to a corner booth. Big Mike was drinking 190 proof grain alcohol on the rocks. Alice ordered setups, and they poured drinks from Big Mike's jug. Alice kept watching for the brown men.
What's the matter, Professor?
Here in the booth, acoustics offered some relief from the band.
I'm in a bind. I want you to do something for me. I need a place to work, somewhere quiet, where I can sort of hide out.
Someone after you?
Mike turned to casually survey the dimly lit crowd. Alice quickly moved deeper into the booth.
You see someone out there?
No.
Big Mike waved a hand to erase the exchange.
You just looking over your shoulder every 2 seconds. So bugged you're about to jump right out of your skin. Your husband got the troops out?
Alice hesitated, trying to decide how much to tell Big Mike. She could see no way out of not cluing him in a little.
No, not that. It has to do with my experiments.
Then who are they? Tex-Aero's Mickey Mouse cops?
No, government brown men.
Big Mike whistled. He sipped his drink slowly, cautiously.
I don't know if I better get involved. Uncle Sammy's got this boy's number.
Alice remembered that Big Mike had met with some sort of difficulty in Laredo. He had bought some native pottery in Mexico for his mother, or so he had said. A customs inspector happened to notice that the packing crate had a protective double bottom, padded with marijuana. Big Mike's probation still had 6 months to go.
All I want you to do is find me a room, preferably someplace where they wouldn't think to look. That means it has to be someplace with someone I don't know. I think they know all my movements for weeks past.
Big Mike considered the problem.
You got your heat?
Big Mike didn't have a car. He'd lost his driver's license for driving while intoxicated.
It's at a drive-in movie.
Big Mike nodded, thinking.
I may know a place. Someplace that's really something else. Let me go make a phone call.
He slid out of the booth. As Big Mike disappeared into the crowd, Alice became more worried than ever about the possibility of the brown men finding her here. The more she thought about it, she scooted deeper into the booth, colliding violently with Betsy, who misunderstood.
Here?
She put a hand on Alice experimentally. In answer, Alice pushed her hand away.
Look over my shoulder. If you see any young men in brown suits, tell me.
I once knew a gal queer for guys in Bermuda shorts, but brown suits are something new.
Alice felt a wave of affection. She missed Betsy and her directness, her lack of the artifice that confused relations among most people. She hadn't seen her since she moved back with Big Mike.
How you been?
Betsy shrugged.
The same. I've been thinking what you said about repetition. It makes a lot of sense. I think that's my hang-up. Ever since I left home, I've been doing the same thing over and over. I want something new.
Repetition produces boredom.
Alice said, thinking aloud. She took out her notebook and made an entry.
Somebody was telling me about a book. It's all about these experiments they are doing in sex. These scientists have some kind of machine that women can use. It controls speed, size, and everything. You know the book I mean?
Alice nodded.
I'll get you a copy.
The book cost $10.
I don't want the book. I want the machine.
I doubt they're for sale. The scientists designed them especially for the experiment.
You are a scientist. You know all about machines. You could build me one.
Instantly, Alice was intrigued by the possibility. She remembered that the scientists had found sexual response of women to be higher with the machines than in any other form of release. She couldn't resist the challenge. If computers were an extension of man's memory store, why couldn't machines be designed to serve as other extensions?
All right, I'll try. If Big Mike can find me somewhere to work.
Big Mike returned, frowning.
I found it, but you still got to swing it, man. When I tried to explain, she thought you wanted to build a hydrogen bomb or something.
She?
Mad Madeline. Know her?
I haven't had the pleasure.
The pleasure will be all hers. Come on. I've acquired us a heap from one of the guys in the band.
End of episode 4.